Hey guys, so in this video I'm simply going to take you through a 30-minute rapid game that I played against another 1400 rated opponent, and particularly we're just going to look at the various tactics that I used and how one player eventually gets an advantage. Okay. Also, you may be interested that the openings played that white plays the London system, and then I play with the black pieces, the black lion, in response. So we'll just start. So we've got d4, d6 is played, and then bishop comes out to f4, so that's announcing the London system. I play knight to f6, and then knight to d7 is going to follow. e3, knight comes out to d7, and the second bishop comes out to its normal place. And then I play e5, which is normally the next move in the London. We exchange pawns in the middle, and the bishop advances to g5 to pin the knight against the queen. That does mean that the bishop has now moved twice in the opening, which is maybe not the best idea. It also gives me the opportunity to develop my bishop to e7, breaking the pin and also clearing space for my king to castle. So white, I think with this move, I think that's an inaccuracy. I think white has now given up the initiative in the opening. Okay, knight comes out to c3 and h6 to kick the bishop away. Bishop retreats to h4 and g5 follows. These are standard moves in the black lion. The idea with this is that this knight is now going to come around to f8 and then g6 and then very often to f4, but obviously f4 is not available at this point in time. But I guess if my knight can come round to g6, at least it'll kick the bishop again and also protect this pawn in the middle, so I'm figuring it's okay to play h6 and g5. So the bishop's now spent a lot of time running away. I push b6 in order to fianchetto my light squared bishop because I noticed that the pawn on g2 is currently undefended. White places bishop in, I fianchetto my bishop, and white spots the threat and blocks it with f3. The king still not castled, well, neither king is castled. I play c5, getting a nice pawn chain going on there on the dark squares. I'm starting to think now as well that if you see how many of my pawns are on dark squares, 6 out of 7 of them, which is going to make this bishop, it's going to make life hard for this bishop, and I think this bishop now struggles to get into the game anymore. So he's already used a lot of moves, that one particular dark square bishop. So we have an exchange, and white decides to castle long. So we've got a bit of a barrage. We've got a queen and a rook looking at this knight. It's currently defended twice by the king, the queen, and then the king, which is fine, because if the queen takes first, queen takes, rook takes, and king takes rook, that would leave me up an exchange. But I decide to move my bishop to c6 anyway, just to reinforce this knight, because I would like to maybe castle kingside, but I can't do that right now because the king is the last defender of the knight. Another option, I guess, is to move the knight away, because then if we have, for example, queen takes, I've got rook takes, and I've still got 2 defenders on d8 on that square. Okay, so the last knight is developed by white. I decide to push f6 and pretty much finalize my dark square pawn wall here. Remember, white has now given up his light squared bishop, so having my pawns on dark squares at this point in the game will help to exclude the white's remaining bishop. Queen pushes forward to d3. Now what I'm thinking is, I thought you have to think, why did my opponent make that move? And what I'm anticipating is the queen wanting to come to g6 and cause me some problems. So there's no way of blocking that check. I'd have to move my king to f8. These pawns are currently defended, but I didn't really want to allow white to execute that plan. You've always got to be careful about allowing a queen inside your camp. So I move my knight then back to f8 to cover the g6 square. I know that my queen's okay because she's protected 3 times by my rook, my bishop, and then finally the king. Queen comes in anyway to f5, which is not so threatening. So I drop my bishop back to d7, threatening to capture the queen. Then if rook captures, I get the rook, so I would win that exchange. And then the queen comes back, and now I start to push my pawns up the king side, start a pawn storm. So b5. Rook comes forward to d2, probably preparing for this rook to come along and double up. So in anticipation of that, it's another preventative prophylactic move. I advance my rook to a7 to be the 4th defender. Now you've got 1, 2, 3 and the knight, 4. Plenty of defense for that bishop. The rooks do double up. Now what this effectively means is still that this bishop is actually pinned, so this can't really move, otherwise I'd lose my queen and be in check. So I break the pin by moving the bishop out of the way. First I calculated rook takes, and then I've got, for example, knight takes, and white's just given up the exchange for no real reason, so I'm okay there. The knight comes into d5, threatening my bishop. Now I'm thinking I've got a whole load of pawns on dark squares. Which is the best piece? Is it white's advanced knight, or is it my bishop that's currently stuck behind a bunch of pawns? So I'm not too worried about that, and I decide to push my bishop out to f5, where it's defended by my queen, to kick this queen out of the way. Now what we realised is, I think that my opponent and I both figured this out around the same time, is that the queen actually has no squares now, which is, I didn't realise, honestly didn't realise when I played the move. So can't go here or here because of the pawn, can't go here or here because of the bishop, can't capture the bishop because of the queen, can't go along that diagonal, pawn's got that, pawn's got that, pawn's got that, pawn's got that. So the queen actually has no squares. So my opponent thought for a while on this move, and finally came up with a very good response, which is knight takes bishop. Okay, what that does is, of course, opens up at least one square where white's queen could escape to. Plus it comes with an attack on my queen. So if I take queen and white takes my queen, it's also threatening my rook. So I don't think, I'd have to move my rook out the way, and my bishop would still be in danger. So that exchange I don't think would work, so I'm pretty much obliged to take the knight. Queen comes to that safe square on d5, and I put in a skewer. So this rook is defended again by 3 pieces. There's a lot of activity on this d-file. So the rook is defended, the queen has to move out of the way. I bring my bishop back again to kick the queen again, and the queen goes to a3. Then I decide to simplify a little bit, exchange a pair of rooks off. I didn't really like the strength of those doubled rooks on the d-file. Now I'm starting to bring my knight up. I'm thinking, where can my knight go? I mean, that's a lovely square because it would fork the queen and the rook. White plays a pawn forward, so possibly that's actually to defend that square. If so, that's a good spot by white. I develop my final piece. My remaining rook comes across the d8. And now white's bishop has to maneuver round this massive pawns on dark squares there in order to get into the game. So we're expecting probably an e4 push at some point. I decide just to move my king out of the way. It is in line with the queen here, which means that this pawn is pinned, can't move forwards. And also just I figure that white has a dark squared bishop, so my king is generally going to be safer on a light coloured square. And indeed, here comes e4. And so because this opportunity has now disappeared, I'm thinking about rerouting my knight through some other means. So likely to come back to c6 and then maybe b4 or to here on d4. So we'll see. Now white decides to initiate the final rook swap. That's fine, and wins a pawn because my queen recaptures. My queen was the only defender of this. In fact, we can also see that there are actually two attackers on that piece now, which is something I missed in the game. So the queen captures that pawn, but I'm not too concerned about losing that pawn because it now means that there's at least a semi-open file towards white's king. My king looks fairly secure here. It's got a bit of a pawn wall. White's king's a little bit more out in the open. So it's all going to come down now to piece activity and who can get the initiative for the end of the game. So knight to d7 hits the queen. Queen comes in and pins the knight. I move my queen across to c8, where it's at least looking at white's king. Bishop comes in with I don't see any real threat there. So I move my king backwards again to g6, putting him safe. White proposes an exchange of queens and I accept. Okay, now I'm going to get my pieces as active as I can and try and squeeze white out of this game. So knight comes in, bishop comes in to kick the knight, knight comes back, and pawn is moved forward. Now this is a mistake because if you notice now, this pawn is in front of a2, which is otherwise undefended. So moving that pawn forward just offers up a pawn. So I now equalize material again, grabbing my pawn back. White plays a c3. I bring my knight in, so I'm now eyeing up this nice square here where my knight can quite happily live out the rest of the game, defended by a pawn. So king comes in, and I actually decide to put my bishop onto that square because it comes with an attack on the knight. So I'm again gaining tempo, forcing the knight to move. The knight can't move forwards because of this pawn here, so he's going to have to go somewhere else. So it ends up going all the way back to c1. Now comes really the decisive move of the game. So I've been really taking my time. I took my time on the opening. I've got 7 minutes left on my clock. My opponent has 17 minutes left on the clock, so he's still got more than half of his time left, and he blunders. I mean, the next move is pretty dangerous because what I do is I play this bishop. So I'd already put my bishop on the square where I wanted to put my knight, okay? But now I move my bishop there to f1, and there are actually two threats here. The first is obviously my bishop is going to start playing Pac-Man and starting to gobble up this light squared pawn chain that white has in place. Because it's unfortunate that his king is on the wrong side of the board, where he's got a pawn majority on this side. That's where he's strongest. But his king is on this side where there are only two pawns. I, on the other hand, have got my king. My king is moved all the way up here, where it's both defended by and defending my pawn majority. Okay, so there's two issues. One is that the bishop is threatening to start gobbling pawns, but the other one, which my opponent I don't think spotted, is knight to c4 with a fork on the king and on the bishop. So my opponent responded with g3, looking only at the immediate threat but failed to scan the board for any other threats. So I jump in and grab the bishop. And now it's pretty much it's one of those situations where it should be a walk-in, and you just have to focus. But I'll take you through the end game because it works. So I decide to simplify by capturing the knight, exchange, and now I put my knight back on that lovely square on c4 where it's defended by the pawn. And at this point in the game, what I like to do is I like to spot all the squares where my opponent's king cannot go, right? So all of these dark squares here and that light square there, the king cannot move to. So these 2 pawns are stuck, as is this one. So he's only got really kind of 3 pawns that he can move, and the king. So the king moves back, and you know, I have to look at the queen side and think, are there any threats here? And I'm quite comfortable. I think this knight can dwell there quite peacefully. If at any point I want to, I can push a5, and if b takes a5, I've got knight takes a5, which is alright. So all I need to do now is to use this knight to gain an advantage with forks and things like that. So quiet move, push h5, and now in response to h4 I decide to push g4, because I figure if pawn takes, the king can't go there or there, so I'm kind of okay. So pawn takes, king moves towards the knight, but I'm not sure really why, because he can't go there, and he can't go there, and he can't go there or there. So I'm not really clear on the point of that move, unless it's intending to come around here, but still, there's nowhere to go from there. So I just keep pushing pawns, h5, I capture, move back. So you can see now how white's king is going to get very stretched when these pawns are starting to move up the board, and yet he's still got these backwards pawns stuck over there. Their king is not going to be able to defend them all. So the king moves back, I grab a pawn. And now, this is an interesting move, that really something that you need to remember for endgames. When the king moves to that square, if you can move so that you're in line with the king and 2 squares away from the king, this is called opposition. What it means is that the king cannot approach any further, right? Because you've got this kind of force field in front of your king, so the king cannot enter that space. And if you consider that all of these pawns are stuck, they cannot advance, they've got another piece right in their face, the king, all it can really do is move from side to side. Okay. Now I decide to push my a pawn, b takes, knight takes, and it's just now a case of converting the game. Now remember, the king can't go here or here or here. So I'm just manoeuvring around, and it's just a question now of finishing the game without putting my opponent in stalemate. So I'm pushing my pawn. I figure that the king has always got these 2 squares right now. Even if I get a queen, that king can keep just moving backwards and forwards, that's fine. So I do promote my pawn to a queen, and now it's just a case of treading very, very carefully. So I move my queen into f1 with check, king moves back there, another check. As long as your opponent's in check, there can't be a stalemate. Another check, king moves back again, and now I decide to move my pawn up. Okay, because I know that the king has these 2 squares. And I decide to grab the final pawn. Now, got to be very careful here, because this would normally be a stalemate situation. The king can't move to any of these squares without being in check. So I have to move my queen to f3 with check. And we're back in this situation where the king's got these 2 dark squares to go to. Now here, of course, same deal. If I'd have moved that forward and promoted it to a queen, then it would have been stalemate, so I mustn't do that. Put the king in check, and then queen finally, promote the pawn on e1, and that is checkmate. So a tidy game, one that I enjoyed, and it really did pivot on that double attack that my opponent rushed and missed. Okay, so lots and lots of basic tactics overlaid with other tactics, and finally just taking the time in the end game to convert a winning position. Quite satisfying for me. Hope you've picked up a few things from that. I'll see you next time.